You think you know Iran. Most people do, or at least they think they do. A place of tension, a place of threats, a place reduced to headlines, warnings, and maps filled with arrows. But that is not Iran. That is the version you were handed. Because long before the modern world turned this country into a symbol of conflict, Iran was something else entirely. A civilization shaped by empire, faith, trade, poetry, engineering, and survival. Not a footnote to history, one of its central stages. This is a land where cities rose in deserts with almost no mercy in them, where communities learned to live with heat, drought, earthquakes, invasion, collapse, and kept building anyway. Where sacred fire was tended across centuries, where homes were carved into stone, where beauty was not treated as a luxury, but as a way of resisting ruin. And then there is this. One of the most famous objects associated with early ideas of imperial tolerance and restored local worship was not created in Athens, not in Rome, but under Cyrus the Great after the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE. Today that object, the Cyrus cylinder, still stands as one of the most discussed artifacts of the ancient world. Scholars debate the modern human rights label, but no one disputes its historical importance. So no, Iran is not a simple story. It is not a headline. It is not a stereotype. It is not a country you understand by looking at it from a distance. It is a place the world has talked about for decades and misunderstood for just as long. This is Iran, not the one you were told to fear, the one you were never really shown. At the mouth of one of the most strategic waterways on Earth, there is an island that does not look real. From the mainland, Hormuz appears almost restrained, a low, dark mass sitting just off the coast. Nothing in that first silhouette prepares you for what happens when you step onto it. Because Hormuz is not just an island, it is a geological eruption frozen in color. The land here was pushed upward by ancient salt formations, rising through the earth over immense spans of time, carrying with them layers of mineral-rich rock that turned parts of the island into something almost surreal. And then you see the shoreline. The beaches are red, not faintly red, not sunset red, but the deep, iron-stained red of earth so saturated it seems impossible at first glance. On Hormuz, that color is not decoration. It is part of daily life. For generations, local residents have used the island's red soil, known as golak, as pigment in traditional foods and in local craft practices. What looks to an outsider like a visual spectacle has long been understood here as material, resource, and inheritance. In places like Rainbow Valley, the island becomes even stranger. Bands of color run across the terrain as if the cliffs were painted in layers: red, yellow, orange, white. The visible record of a landscape built by pressure, uplift, and time rather than by anything human. But Hormuz does not exist in isolation from the world. It sits beside the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical oil transit choke points on the planet. At its narrowest point, the strait is about 21 miles wide, and a major share of global oil trade passes through it. So the island lives with a strange duality. It is one of the most visually extraordinary places in Iran, and one of the most strategically exposed. Beauty and pressure occupy the same coastline, and that pressure is not only military or geopolitical. The Gulf itself is an extreme marine environment, already under mounting stress from warming waters and broader climate pressures affecting its ecosystems. That is what makes Hormuz unforgettable. Not just that it is beautiful, but that it feels like a place where the Earth revealed too much at once. Color, heat, minerals, vulnerability, history, and left human beings to figure out how to live on top of it. There are places in the world where people built homes from the land. And then there is Kandahar, where people built their lives inside it. In the mountains of northwestern Iran, not far from Tabriz, the village rises out of the valley like something halfway between architecture and geology. From a distance, it barely reads as a settlement at all. It looks more like a field of stone towers shaped by wind, weather, and time. But Kandahar is not abandoned. It is not a ruin, and it is not a fantasy landscape preserved for tourists. It is a living village. For centuries, families here have carved homes directly into volcanic rock, creating rooms, stairways, storage spaces, and domestic interiors inside conical formations left behind by ancient eruptions. What appears at first like a miracle of design is in fact an adaptation. Human life learning how to disappear into the mountain and stay there. The stone itself made that possible. Studies of Kandahar's rock-cut architecture describe these spaces as a form of earth-sheltered building, where the surrounding mass of rock helps reduce temperature swings and improves energy efficiency. In simple terms, the mountain insulates. In a region of cold winters and sharp seasonal variation, that is not just elegant, it is practical. Inside, the logic becomes even clearer. These are not caves in the romantic sense. They are homes, adapted over generations. Plastered walls, carved niches, doorways widened by use. Spaces shaped not by a single act of construction, but by repetition, repair, and inheritance. That is what makes Kandahar so powerful. Not simply that people once sheltered in stone, but that they never fully stopped. In many parts of the world, rock-cut settlements became archaeological sites or boutique escapes. Kandahar remained domestic, ordinary, continuous, a place where geology is not scenery, but a dress. And like so many places in Iran, its challenge today is not whether the landscape can still sustain life. It is whether the next generation will choose to remain inside a way of living shaped by older necessities, when opportunity now pulls toward the city below. That tension between inheritance and departure is how ancient places are lost now, not always by war or disaster, but by a quieter kind of leaving. Some cities survive the desert by importing power, water, and machinery. Yazd survived by learning how air moves. Set deep in the Iranian plateau, on a barren plain shaped by heat and scarcity, Yazd is one of those places that seems almost impossible at first glance. A historic city in a desert climate, built far from abundance, and yet sustained for centuries through systems designed not to defeat the environment, but to negotiate with it. That intelligence is written into the skyline. Above the roofs rise the badgers, wind catchers, tall brick towers designed to capture moving air, funnel it downward, and cool interior spaces without electricity. In Yazd, they are so central to the city's identity that the city has long been known as the City of Wind Catchers. And that is what makes Yazd feel so advanced. Not because it is futuristic, but because it solved a future problem long ago. These towers are not decorative relics. They are climate-responsive architecture in one of its oldest and most elegant forms: passive cooling, shaped by observation, repetition, and centuries of trial. In a place where heat could easily dominate every hour of daily life, the city learned to make the invisible useful. The walls of Yazd tell the same story: mud brick, sun-dried earth, thick surfaces that belong to the desert because they are made from it. The city does not stand apart from its landscape. It rises out of it, materially, visually, almost philosophically. Nothing here suggests excess. Everything suggests adaptation. But Yazd is not only an engineering achievement, it is also one of the rare places where long religious continuity remains physically visible. UNESCO describes the historic city as a place where Islam, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism have all left living traces in the urban fabric. Mosques, synagogues, fire temples, homes, water structures, and neighborhoods shaped by coexistence rather than erasure. At the Yazd Atash Baram, that continuity becomes almost literal. The current temple building dates to the 20th century, but it enshrines a sacred fire that tradition holds has been preserved since 470 CE. Whether one approaches that fact historically, spiritually, or symbolically, the meaning is the same. This is a city that measures time differently. So when night falls in Yazd and wind enters the towers above the old houses, the city feels less like a ruin of the past than a proof of concept. A city that breathes, a city that cools itself, a city that understood, long before modern sustainability language existed, that survival in a hostile climate begins with humility, not with control, with cooperation. If Hormuz feels like the earth showing off, Isfahan feels like human beings doing the same. Because this city was not built merely to function. It was built to project order. When Shah Abbas I remade Isfahan in the early 17th century, he turned it into a Safavid capital organized around one overwhelming idea: that power could be made visible through space, symmetry, ceremony, and scale. At the center stood Maidan Imam, built at the beginning of the 17th century and framed by monumental buildings and arcades, one of the great urban statements of the Persian world. Here, architecture does more than impress, it instructs. The square gathers palace, mosque, bazaar, and imperial spectacle into one coherent field, as if government, faith, commerce, and daily life were meant to be read together. UNESCO describes the ensemble as an exceptional testimony to the social and cultural life of Safavid Persia. On the southern side, the Imam Mosque pushes that logic even further. Britannica notes that the mosque is celebrated not only for its colored tilework, but for its precise vaulting. Mathematics turned into spiritual authority, geometry turned into persuasion. And that is what makes Isfahan feel so controlled, so deliberate, so unforgettable. Nothing important here seems accidental. Not the alignments, not the procession of facades, not the sense that beauty itself has been disciplined into statecraft. But Isfahan was never only one tradition speaking to itself. Across the river in New Julfa, Shah Abbas settled an Armenian merchant community whose commercial importance helped bind Isfahan to wider trade networks. Sources from the Met and Britannica both note the role of relocated Armenians in the silk trade and in the city's commercial life. That is where Vank Cathedral enters the story. Its presence makes clear that Safavid Isfahan was not culturally simple. New Julfa developed as a major Armenian quarter, and the Vank complex remains one of its defining monuments. Even the official UNESCO tentative listing emphasizes the scale and institutional richness of the monastery ensemble. So Isfahan is not powerful because it is uniform. It is powerful because it reveals how an empire tried to organize difference: faith, trade, ethnicity, ritual, inside a single urban vision. And yet even cities designed to symbolize permanence are not immune to fragility. The Zayande Rud, the river that long helped define life in Isfahan, has faced drought and negative water balance in recent decades. A 2025 water resources analysis describes prolonged dryness, ecological damage, and major stress across the basin. That tension changes the city's meaning, because Isfahan still looks like certainty. But beneath that certainty now sits a quieter question. What happens when a city built around balance begins to lose one of the forces that once sustained it? That is why Isfahan matters, not just as one of Iran's most beautiful places, but as proof that architecture can turn power into form, and that even the most perfected forms remain vulnerable to time, scarcity, and change. Some cities impress you with scale. Shiraz does something quieter. It reaches you first through atmosphere, through softness, through gardens, through the sense that beauty here is not an ornament added later, but part of the city's natural language. For centuries, Shiraz has been associated with poetry, cultivation, and refinement, and that reputation is inseparable from the city's identity in Iranian memory. That feeling becomes physical at the Nasir al-Mulk Mosque. Completed in 1888, the mosque is one of Shiraz's most recognizable monuments, famous for its extensive colored glass and the way morning light spills through the facade into the prayer hall. At sunrise, the interior stops feeling fixed. Color moves across the carpets, the columns, the stone, and for a few brief hours, the building seems less constructed than awakened. What makes that moment so powerful is not only that it is beautiful, it is that it is precise. The mosque's effect depends on orientation, timing, and light. It is architecture working with the turning of the earth itself, an example of how Persian design could turn geometry, ornament, and daily ritual into a single experience. In Shiraz, grace is not vague, it is engineered. But Shiraz is not only a city of light, it is also a city of language. At the tomb of Hafez, one of the most beloved poets in the Persian-speaking world, the relationship between literature and daily life is still visible. Hafez died in 1390, and his tomb in Shiraz remains a place of continual visitation, reflection, and cultural devotion. His poems are not treated as relics. They are still read, quoted, sung, and turned to in moments of uncertainty. That is why Hafez matters so much to this city. People do not come here only to honor a dead poet. They come because his voice never entirely left. The modern memorial complex dates largely to the 1930s, though the site had earlier structures long before that. Today it stands in a garden setting that feels entirely appropriate to Shiraz. Not severe, not monumental in the imperial sense, but intimate, lyrical, and open to return. And that may be the real character of Shiraz. Not power displayed in stone, as in Isfahan, not survival carved into desert, as in Yazd, but a city where beauty is allowed to remain tender, where glass, verse, gardens, and memory all seem to belong to the same emotional climate. In a country often described from the outside in terms of pressure and conflict, Shiraz offers a different truth, that civilizations do not endure by force alone. They also endure through the things people keep returning to when force has failed them. Light, language, ritual, and the stubborn human need to make meaning out of passing time. There are ruins that feel ancient, and then there is Persepolis, a place that still feels official. Even now, with broken columns open to the sky and stairways worn by time, the site does not read like the remains of a dead city. It reads like a statement. Persepolis was the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Darius I and developed by his successors as one of the great royal centers of ancient Iran. That distinction matters, because Persepolis was not built simply to house people. It was built to stage power. High on its terrace, the complex gathered audience halls, gateways, palaces, and reliefs into a single imperial composition. UNESCO describes it as an outstanding example of Achaemenid architecture and a major archaeological site whose planning, monumental scale, and artistic achievement express the power of the empire at its height. But what makes Persepolis unforgettable is not only its size. It is the way the empire chose to represent itself. On the stairways of the Apadana, delegation after delegation approaches in carved stone, figures from across the empire bringing tribute, each rendered with distinct clothing, posture, and objects. Britannica specifically notes Armenian tribute bearers in the reliefs, and the visual program as a whole presents imperial order through procession rather than battlefield chaos. That is a remarkable choice, because many ancient imperial monuments celebrate domination through scenes of violence. Persepolis does something subtler. It presents the empire as structure, hierarchy, ceremony, and managed difference. Many peoples, one court, one king, one political imagination carved into stone. That reading also fits what we know of Achaemenid statecraft more broadly under rulers like Darius, whose reign is remembered for major administrative organization as well as monumental building. This is also the point where the shadow of Cyrus reappears. The Cyrus cylinder, issued after the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, is often described in popular culture as the first charter of human rights. But the British Museum is more careful. It states plainly that the cylinder says nothing of human rights in the modern sense, even though it remains historically important for what it reveals about kingship, restoration, and imperial messaging. And that makes Persepolis more interesting, not less, because it reminds us that empires do not only rule through armies, they rule through images, through ritual, through the stories they tell about themselves. What survives here is one of the clearest versions of that story ever cut into stone. And yet even stone has entered a more vulnerable age. UNESCO's recent monitoring language for Persepolis specifically warns of the need to track air pollutants, weathering, and environmental factors affecting the site over time. The danger today is not a single invading army at the gate, but slow, continuous loss, details softened by exposure, surfaces weakened by forces too diffuse to dramatize and too real to ignore. That is why Persepolis still matters, not only because it preserves the memory of an empire, but because it preserves the way that empire wanted to be seen: ordered, immense, many-sided, and eternal. The empire is gone. The message remains. And for now, the stone is still speaking. In the desert, survival is rarely dramatic. It is usually quiet, measured, engineered one generation at a time. That is what BAM was. On the southern edge of Iran's high plateau, in an oasis sustained by underground water channels, BAM grew into one of the great fortified desert settlements of the region. UNESCO describes BAM and its cultural landscape as an outstanding example of human life shaped in direct negotiation with an arid environment, made possible by the long development of qanats, subterranean channels that carried water across the desert by gravity. At the center stood Argi Bam, the citadel, one of the world's most important mud brick fortified complexes. This was not architecture imposed on the desert from outside. It was architecture born from the same earth, using mud brick construction and hydraulic intelligence to make permanence possible in a place that offered almost none for free. That is what made Bam so extraordinary. It was not only a city in the desert, it was a system. Water drawn invisibly below ground, agriculture sustained in an oasis, trade routes crossing the Iranian plateau, walls, towers, and neighborhoods rising from the same material as the land itself. UNESCO notes Bam's long position at the crossroads of important trade routes and its deep historical connection to Qanat-based life in the oasis. And then, in the early morning of December 26, 2003, the ground broke that system apart. The 2003 Bam earthquake, magnitude 6.6, killed more than 26,000 people, devastated the modern city, and largely destroyed the fortress itself. What had taken centuries to shape was shattered in seconds. That is the part that changes Bam from a heritage site into something more difficult to forget. Because Bam is not simply a story about what the desert built, it is also a story about what the earth can take back. And yet, even here, that was not the end. UNESCO's conservation record makes clear that reconstruction and safeguarding continued for years after the disaster, combining local workmanship, national effort, and international expertise. The site was placed on the list of World Heritage in danger after the earthquake and later removed after major corrective work and conservation progress. So Bam stands for two truths at once. First, that human beings once built one of the most sophisticated desert settlements in the region by understanding water, earth, and climate with astonishing precision. Second, that even a civilization this intelligent, this adapted, this patient can still be broken open in under half a minute. But the final meaning of Bam is not destruction. It is reconstruction. The citadel was not abandoned to become a monument to loss. It has been studied, stabilized, repaired, and in part reassembled from its own surviving fabric. The same landscape that taught Bam how to endure scarcity is now part of the reason it continues to endure memory. That is why Bam belongs in the story of Iran. Not because it escaped disaster, but because it didn't and still refused to disappear. Some cities announce their beauty from a distance. Kashan does the opposite. From the outside, much of the old city feels restrained. Earth-toned walls, muted streets, architecture that seems almost determined not to reveal too much too soon. That understatement fits Kashan's history. Britannica notes the city's long importance as a center of ceramics, tiles, textiles, and carpets, a place shaped by trade and craftsmanship rather than by spectacle alone. And that is exactly why Kashan is so effective. Because here, beauty is not pushed outward, it is protected. Step through the gate of one of the old merchant houses, and the city changes all at once. What looked plain from the street opens into courtyards, pools, plasterwork, carved surfaces, and rooms organized around light, shade, privacy, and airflow. In Kashan, architecture was not only about display, it was about control, of temperature, of visibility, of comfort, of what the outside world was allowed to see. That broader logic also fits the historic character of the Fin-Sialk-Kashan axis, which UNESCO's tentative listing describes as a long civilizational landscape shaped by water, settlement, and continuity. That hidden world reaches one of its clearest expressions in the city's great historic houses. The most famous examples, including the Tabatabai House and the Borojurdi House, have become shorthand for the sophistication of 19th century domestic design in Kashan. Inward-looking mansions where refinement was concentrated behind modest exteriors rather than projected into the street. Even without relying on every romantic detail attached to them, their survival makes one thing unmistakable. Kashan mastered the art of private grandeur. And then there is Fin Garden, Here, the logic of concealment gives way to something more controlled and ceremonial. Fin is one of the component sites of UNESCO's Persian garden inscription, a tradition in which geometry, enclosure, water, and planting are brought together to create an ordered world within harsher surroundings. In Kashan, that idea becomes especially powerful because the garden depends on spring water emerging in a landscape where water has always been precious. That is what Kashan understands so well. In a dry land, beauty is strongest when it is disciplined, when it cools the air, when it organizes space, when it turns water into structure rather than ornament. So Kashan does not overwhelm you the way Isfahan does. It does not astonish you the way Hormuz does. It wins more slowly, through restraint, through craftsmanship, through the feeling that the city's deepest confidence lies in what it never needed to advertise. And maybe that is the real lesson of Kashan. Not all civilizations prove themselves through monuments that dominate the horizon. Some leave their clearest signature in the spaces they chose to hide. Places where wealth became elegance, climate became design, and privacy itself became a form of beauty. In most places, architecture separates people. A roof is a roof. A street is a street. A wall marks the edge between private life and public movement. Masuleh was built on a different idea. Set high in the mountains of Gilan, in northern Iran, the village climbs a steep slope in stacked terraces, as if it had grown out of the hillside instead of being placed on it. Its form is so unusual that the route through the village does not run beside the houses. It runs across them. The roof of one home becomes the walking surface for the level above. In Masuleh, buildings and streets are part of the same structure. That is what makes the village unforgettable. Not simply that it is beautiful, but that it turns architecture into a social agreement. To move through Masuleh is to cross thresholds that, in most other places, would never overlap. Your path may also be your neighbor's ceiling. The public route and the private dwelling depend on each other physically, every day, without needing to be explained. The village works because the built environment makes cooperation unavoidable. And the setting only deepens that feeling. Gilan is one of the wettest parts of Iran, shaped by Caspian moisture and a climate that feels dramatically different from the country's drier interior. That is part of why Masuleh can feel so surprising in the story of Iran. After deserts, salt, and bare stone, this landscape arrives in mist, forest, and rain. So Masuleh does not read like a desert adaptation. It reads like a mountain negotiation. The village rises where the terrain leaves almost no room for conventional urban planning. Instead of flattening the slope, the settlement accepted it. Instead of imposing roads for vehicles, it evolved as a pedestrian place. Modern accounts of the village consistently note that cars do not enter its historic fabric, not because of a romantic gesture, but because the form of the village was never meant for them. That choice gives Masuleh its unusual emotional texture. It feels communal without being theatrical, dense without feeling urban, ancient without becoming inert. But like many extraordinary places, Masuleh is now under pressure from the very attention that keeps it economically alive. Tourism has increased the visibility of the village, and with visibility comes stress. On circulation, on upkeep, on a settlement pattern designed for residents long before it was designed to host outsiders. UNESCO's 2023 review of Masuleh as a cultural landscape also shows that the site is now being discussed in terms of heritage management at an international level. That is why Masuleh matters, because it is more than a mountain village with a clever layout. It is a place where architecture made interdependence visible, where roofs become roads, where private structures carry public life, and where a community learned centuries ago that in difficult terrain, the only way forward is sometimes quite literally across one another. Tehran does not reveal itself all at once. It spreads out beneath the Alborz Mountains in layers: geographic, economic, emotional. From north to south, the city drops by roughly 2,000 feet, from about 5,600 feet above sea level at its upper edge to around 3,600 feet at its lower limits. Britannica notes that this dramatic change in elevation has shaped not only Tehran's climate and physical form, but also its social geography. In this city, altitude is never just altitude. It can also feel like status, air quality, temperature, and distance from pressure. That pressure is literal. Tehran sits in one of Iran's most seismically dangerous urban zones. Multiple fault systems affect the metropolitan region, and Iranian reporting in 2025 cited an earlier IIEES estimate placing the probability of a major earthquake within a 100-kilometer radius of central Tehran at 40 to 70% over a 2 to 12-year window. That number should be treated as a warning, not a countdown, but the broader point is undeniable. This is a capital built with the expectation of rupture beneath it. And yet Tehran is not a city defined only by threat. Inside Golestan Palace, the Qajar imagination of power still survives in astonishing form. UNESCO describes Golestan as one of the oldest historic complexes in Tehran, shaped most decisively in the 19th century when it became the royal residence of the Qajar dynasty. It is not simply a palace. It is a compressed vision of courtly Iran at the moment it was absorbing, translating, and reworking outside influence into its own aesthetic language. That reaches its peak in the Hall of Mirrors. UNESCO's nomination material describes mirrors set across the hall so that light fractures and multiplies across the interior. The effect is more than decorative. It feels almost metaphysical, as if the room were designed to deny the idea that light ever comes from a single source. One candle, one reflection, one surface would never have been enough. Step outside those walls, and Tehran changes register immediately. The palace preserves a vision of splendor. The city beyond it lives in acceleration. Traffic, density, inequality, heat, infrastructure stress, and the constant background knowledge that the ground itself is not fully trustworthy, these are part of Tehran's daily texture. Recent reporting also ties broader environmental stress in Iran, including subsidence and water-related strain, to growing concern over the vulnerability of cities and heritage alike. That is what makes Tehran such an important final urban chapter in the story of Iran. Because here, more clearly than almost anywhere else, the country's old pattern becomes visible again. Beauty beside strain, grandeur beside fragility, continuity beside the possibility of sudden breakage. Tehran lives with all of it. A capital pressed against mountains, a metropolis divided by elevation, a city of mirrors built over fault lines. And maybe that is why Tehran matters. Not because it resolves Iran's contradictions, but because it contains them, at full scale, in real time, every day. By now, the pattern is hard to miss. Again and again, Iran appears as a place shaped by pressure, an arid plateau ringed by mountain systems, crossed by deserts, marked by scarcity, and exposed to recurring seismic risk. That physical reality is not a side note to the story, it is the story's foundation. And yet what rises from that pressure is not emptiness, it is continuity. Iran is home to one of the world's deepest concentrations of historic cultural landscapes and monuments, from Persepolis in Isfahan to Yazd and Bam. UNESCO's listing for Iran spans sites tied to empire, religion, hydraulic engineering, gardens, trade, and urban life across many centuries, which is another way of saying that this civilization did not survive in one form alone. It survived by changing form without losing itself. That may be the real lesson of Iran. Not that it was spared hardship, it wasn't. Not that it found stability and kept it forever, it didn't. What it developed instead was something more durable, a civilizational habit of adaptation. Cities learned to cool themselves, move water underground, build inward, build upward, build in stone, build in mud, rebuild after rupture, and preserve meaning even when permanence failed. That reading is an inference from the places we have just seen, but it is a grounded one. And that is why Iran matters now, not only historically, because more and more of the modern world is beginning to face conditions that older societies in places like Iran never had the luxury of ignoring. Heat, water stress, fragility, environmental exposure, and the certainty that no built order is ever final. Iran does not offer a simple model, but it does preserve a long record of what it looks like when a civilization learns to live without that illusion. So Iran endures not because it conquered uncertainty, but because it learned how to remain itself inside it. Not untouched, not unchanged, but unbroken in the deeper sense. And maybe that is the final reason this country has been so often misunderstood. People keep looking at Iran as a problem to be explained, when in many ways it is something older and more difficult than that. A civilization that kept going, through drought, through invasion, through collapse, through rebuilding, through time. That is Iran, not the caricature, not the headline, not the fear, the endurance.